In the spring of 1856, in the small Moravian town of Freiburg, today known as Przybor in the Czech Republic, the air smelled of wood smoke, wet earth, and fresh bread from the communal ovens. The streets were narrow, lined with modest homes, whose windows flickered with oil lamps. Above a blacksmith's workshop, in a cramped apartment that hardly distinguished itself from the others on the street, a child was born who would alter how humanity understood itself. His name, heavy with tradition and hope, was Sigmund Shlomo Freud. Later he would shorten it to Sigmund, a name cleaner, sharper, easier to carry across borders. The circumstances of his birth already hinted at the contradictions that would shape his life. His father, Jakob, was 40 years old, a wool merchant with streaks of failure in his business ventures, but a stubborn pride in his Jewish heritage. Jakob's first marriage had produced children older than his second wife, Amalia. Amalia, at only 21, was strikingly young, with sharp features and penetrating eyes that seemed to pierce through the people she met. She adored her first son with a fervor that bordered on prophecy. "My golden Siggy," she called him, convinced from the start that greatness awaited him. Mothers always say such things, but in this case, her insistence seemed to take root in the boy's mind like a seed. The family constellation was bewildering. Sigmund had half-brothers old enough to be his father and nephews who were technically his elders. Explaining who belonged where in the family tree was like trying to solve a riddle. One of his playmates was his nephew John, a boy older than him, but socially his peer. Their relationship swung unpredictably between friendship and rivalry, a tension that would echo in Freud's later explorations of how love and conflict intertwine. From his earliest years, Freud's imagination was colored by religion and superstition, though he would later claim to have abandoned both. A Catholic nursemaid cared for him during his toddler years, filling his head with vivid tales of heaven and hell, angels and demons, salvation and damnation. For the boy, these stories became as real as the toys he clutched. Then, suddenly, she was gone, dismissed after being caught stealing. To young Sigmund, she vanished without explanation, leaving behind an aching absence and a set of images that would haunt him for life. The first encounter with disappearance, with something both intimate and incomprehensible, had left its mark. When Sigmund was 4, the family moved to Vienna, joining the stream of Jewish families who sought opportunity in the capital of the Habsburg Empire. Vienna in the 1860s was a city of contrasts, opulent palaces and concert halls on one side, overcrowded tenements on the other. The Freud family lived in a succession of cramped apartments where the walls were thin and poverty was a constant presence. Jakob's business rarely thrived, bills piled up, and the family learned to stretch resources as far as possible. But Amalia's faith in her son never dimmed. No matter how little they had, she insisted that her Siggy was destined for more than the grey anonymity of the ghetto. At school, the boy revealed himself as extraordinary. His teachers quickly recognized a mind that consumed knowledge as if starved. Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, English, all entered his memory like treasures stored in a vault. He was reading Shakespeare in the original before his peers had mastered grammar. His essays outshone those of his classmates, not only for their precision, but for their intensity. He was not content merely to repeat what he had been taught. He demanded to know why. He questioned, challenged, probed. The headmaster noted both admiration and exasperation. This was a boy who would not stop pushing. Freud's drive was more than mere ambition. It was what his family called his greed for knowledge. He devoured books the way a starving man devours bread. Histories, plays, poems, scientific treatises, all were absorbed into his restless mind. He wanted not only to learn facts, but to enter into the inner workings of things, to dismantle them and see what machinery ticked beneath. When his sister cried, he wanted to know the hidden cause of her tears. When he dissected a sentence in Latin, he wanted to know not only its grammar, but the strange alchemy by which sounds became meaning. The family noticed, too, his penetrating gaze, a habit of staring that unsettled both children and adults. Sigmund looked at people as if he were already searching for what lay behind their words, as if their faces were puzzles waiting to be solved. The boy, who grew up in poverty, in crowded apartments, already carried the intensity of someone destined to peer into hidden worlds. In 1873, at the age of 17, Sigmund completed his schooling with top marks. His brilliance earned him admiration, but also resentment. His Jewish background ensured that prejudice was never far away. Vienna was a city of high culture and deep anti-Semitism, a place where Jewish families could aspire to intellectual achievement, but were rarely allowed full acceptance. Freud felt this tension early, the sense of being both inside and outside, privileged by intellect but excluded by birth. It sharpened his ambition, even as it etched a permanent awareness of the social barriers he would always face. That same year, he entered the University of Vienna, choosing medicine as his path. It was less a passion for healing than a hunger for discovery that drove him. The decision marked the beginning of a journey that would eventually carry him far beyond biology and chemistry, into the uncharted landscapes of the mind. But even before he set foot in the marble halls of the university, the outlines of his destiny were visible. He was already restless, already curious, already convinced that beneath the surface of the ordinary world lay secrets waiting to be uncovered. The boy from Freiburg, born into poverty, contradictions, and prophecies of greatness, carried within him both fragility and ferocity. He had tasted the mystery of disappearance when his nurse vanished, the hunger of poverty in Vienna's narrow apartments, the intoxicating power of learning when books opened doors to distant worlds. These experiences fused into a single conviction: that life was more than it appeared, that hidden forces shaped even the most ordinary existence. The rest of his life would be devoted to chasing those forces, dragging them into the light, and insisting that humanity learn to face them. When Sigmund Freud entered the University of Vienna in the autumn of 1873, he stepped into a world that promised to quench his greed for knowledge, yet also complicate it in ways he could not anticipate. The university was a sprawling empire of marble corridors and cavernous lecture halls, where young men in dark coats carried notebooks filled with ambition. For Freud, barely 17, the experience was exhilarating. He was a provincial boy from a modest Jewish family, now standing in the intellectual capital of Central Europe, surrounded by professors who thundered about progress, science, and the future. Vienna itself was a paradox. On one hand, it glittered with imperial pageantry, opera houses glowing under chandeliers, carriages rolling past gilded facades. On the other, it reeked of overcrowded tenements, poverty, and prejudice. Freud, as a Jewish student, felt this duality every day. He was allowed into the halls of learning, but never allowed to forget he was an outsider. The anti-Semitic undercurrents of Viennese society sharpened his sense of determination. To succeed, he would have to outwork and outthink his peers, carving a space for himself in a world designed to exclude him. He chose medicine, though his reasons were less practical than they appeared. His family expected a respectable career, something stable that might raise them out of their precarious existence. But Freud's real interest was not healing the sick, but uncovering the hidden laws of life itself. Medicine offered him access to the cutting edge of scientific inquiry. Darwin's ideas had electrified Europe, and in the lecture halls of Vienna, evolution was debated with almost religious fervor. To Freud, the thought that humanity was not a divine creation, but an accident of nature, was not a scandal, it was liberation. If life could be explained by natural laws, then perhaps the mind, too, could be opened like a clock to reveal its mechanisms. His studies were anything but straightforward. Freud was easily distracted, his curiosity pulling him in directions that baffled his professors. He attended philosophy lectures with Franz Brentano, wrestling with questions about consciousness and perception. He wandered into zoology courses, where he embarked on an unlikely project, dissecting eels to determine the location of their reproductive organs. For months, he hunched over slippery specimens, examining gonads under a microscope, until he had sliced open more than 400 eels. His classmates teased him, asking whether he hoped to find answers to human mysteries in the entrails of fish. Yet for Freud, the project represented something more profound, a belief that truth lay hidden in the smallest details, waiting for patient observation to reveal it. The pivotal figure of his student years was Ernst Brücke, a physiologist whose laboratory became Freud's true university. Brücke embodied the new scientific spirit, disciplined, empirical, mercilessly precise. A former military doctor, he ran his lab like a regiment. His steel blue eyes and rigid posture intimidated students, but his intellect inspired awe. Brücke believed in the principle of energy conservation, that all living processes could be explained in terms of physical and chemical laws. No vital spirits, no divine sparks, only matter in motion. This philosophy resonated deeply with Freud, shaping his conviction that even the mysteries of the mind must obey natural laws. Under Brücke's demanding supervision, Freud immersed himself in neurophysiology. He spent endless hours studying the nervous systems of crayfish and lampreys, tracing the delicate fibers that carried signals through primitive organisms. His papers bore dry titles like On the Origin of the Posterior Nerve Roots in the Spinal Cord of Amacoetes, but to him, each discovery was a revelation, a secret whispered by nature under the microscope. He described these moments with near religious awe, as though science had become his temple and the microscope his altar. For 6 years, Freud remained in this world of slides and stains, of nerve cells and cranial dissections. The work was meticulous, exhausting, and often thankless, but it trained him in habits that would shape his later career. The patience to observe what others overlooked, the courage to follow an idea to its unsettling conclusion, and the stubbornness to resist authority when evidence pointed elsewhere. Brücke's lab was unforgiving, but it was also liberating. It taught Freud that even the most complex phenomena could, in principle, be understood. Yet life outside the laboratory intruded with increasing force. Freud's family remained poor, his father's business ventures faltering again and again. Money was a constant concern, and the luxury of endless research began to feel unsustainable. Meanwhile, his own restlessness grew. He was fascinated by literature, philosophy, even politics, and his notebooks from this period reveal a young man torn between disciplines, unsure whether he was a scientist, a philosopher, or perhaps something altogether new. By 1882, a turning point arrived, not in the form of discovery, but of love. At a friend's house, Freud met Martha Bernays, the 21-year-old daughter of a respected Jewish family. She was intelligent, composed, with eyes that seemed to weigh and measure him as they spoke. Within weeks, he was smitten, writing letters that blazed with intensity. "Since I have known you," he confessed, "I have found my breath only in you." The man who had spent years dissecting crayfish nerves now composed pages of fevered poetry, his scientific precision giving way to the turbulence of desire. Their engagement, however, forced him to face reality. Brücke, with the bluntness of a man accustomed to discipline, told Freud that a laboratory career could not support a wife. 2 assistants ahead of him in seniority already had private means. Without wealth, Freud would wait decades for advancement. "It is time," Brücke told him, his eyes softening only slightly, "to leave the laboratory." The words struck like a hammer. The sanctuary of research, the dream of living among microscopes and nerve fibers was no longer possible. If he wanted Martha, if he wanted marriage, he had to enter the practical world of medicine. And so, reluctantly, Freud turned from the precision of the microscope to the chaos of the hospital ward. In July 1882, he joined the Vienna General Hospital, trading the quiet of slides and specimens for the cries of patients, the smell of carbolic acid, and the endless variety of disease. It was a new beginning, a shift that would eventually steer him toward the mysteries of the human mind. The boy from Freiburg, who had devoured languages and dissected eels, who had dreamed of science as a cathedral of truth, now stood at the threshold of an entirely new path. His greed for knowledge had carried him far, but it was love and the demands of reality that pushed him out of the laboratory and into the world of human suffering. Behind him lay the dreams of science. Ahead, the first steps on the road to psychoanalysis. The summer of 1882 marked a decisive break in Sigmund Freud's life. For nearly a decade, he had lived in the cloistered world of laboratories, peering through microscopes, chasing the secrets of nerve fibers and crayfish. But when he entered the wards of the Vienna General Hospital, the air thick with disinfectant and human suffering, he found himself face to face with a very different reality. Patients, not specimens, cries, not silence, uncertainty, not precision. The transition was jarring, yet it was not science alone that forced this change. It was love. That spring, he had met Martha Bernays, and the encounter reshaped everything. She was 21, bright-eyed, slender, with a quiet intelligence that struck him at once. Freud, intense and brooding, carried himself with the air of a man already burdened by destiny. Together, they formed a curious pair, he ambitious but perpetually short of money, she affectionate yet steady, the grounding force he had long lacked. Within weeks, Freud was writing her letters that blazed with emotion. His pen, once devoted to scientific reports, now poured out confessions and demands. "I cannot breathe without you," he wrote. "My soul has only one purpose now, to bind itself to yours." The letters became their lifeline. When Martha's family sent her away to live with relatives near Hamburg, partly to test the seriousness of the young scientist who had suddenly captured her, Freud responded with a torrent of correspondence. Hundreds of letters traveled back and forth, sometimes daily, filled with longing, jealousy, philosophy, and practical worries. He scolded her for paying too much attention to cousins and friends, raged when she admired a novel by another man, and demanded assurances of loyalty that bordered on obsession. Martha, patient but not passive, reassured him, teased him, sometimes ignored his excesses, but always wrote back. Their engagement became a crucible in which Freud's passion, insecurity, and ambition burned together. The hospital years hardened him. He rotated through departments, surgery, dermatology, internal medicine, absorbing knowledge but never quite fitting in. He was skilled enough, but what fascinated him was not the surface of disease, but its hidden mechanisms. While colleagues rushed from bed to bed, Freud lingered, probing for underlying causes, listening more intently than was common. Patients unsettled him, yet they also drew him. In their complaints, he sensed mysteries no scalpel could reveal. One of his most important experiences came under the guidance of Theodor Meinert, the brilliant but erratic neurologist whose lectures opened Freud's mind to the possibility that disorders of thought and behavior might be rooted in the physical structure of the brain. Freud admired him, though Meinert's mood swings and arrogance often left students bewildered. Still, the idea that mental illness could be investigated scientifically lodged firmly in Freud's mind. It was a seed that would eventually grow into psychoanalysis. Meanwhile, Freud stumbled upon a substance that seemed to promise both professional recognition and personal salvation: cocaine. In 1884, he obtained samples of the white powder from South America, still little known in European medicine, and experimented with it himself. The effects were immediate and intoxicating. Fatigue vanished, spirits lifted, confidence surged. He felt, as he later wrote, as though the world had opened before him. Enthusiastically, he prescribed it to patients for depression and pain. He even sent some to Martha, assuring her that it would banish sadness and keep her energized until they could be reunited. Freud went further, publishing glowing papers that hailed cocaine as a wonder drug. He believed it could cure morphine addiction, alleviate melancholia, even serve as a safe anesthetic. For a moment, it seemed as though he had found his breakthrough, the discovery that would make his name and secure his future. But reality turned dark. His close friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, a brilliant physiologist, had developed a crippling morphine habit after an infected wound. Freud, eager to help, gave him cocaine to ease withdrawal. Instead, Fleischl fell into a new torment: cocaine dependency. He suffered hallucinations, convulsions, and paranoia, imagining insects crawling under his skin. The man deteriorated rapidly, his suffering a grim indictment of Freud's enthusiasm. Freud never fully forgave himself, and the episode shadowed him for years. Still, life pressed forward. His engagement with Martha entered its fourth year, and the strain of separation grew unbearable. Freud longed for marriage, but lacked the financial security to support a household. Each letter from Martha contained hints of impatience, though she rarely reproached him outright. To her credit, she endured. For Freud, the delay was agonizing, feeding his insecurities and fueling his ambition. He threw himself into work, desperate to carve out a position that would justify the life he had promised her. By 1885, a glimmer of opportunity appeared. Freud received a traveling grant to study in Paris under Jean-Martin Charcot, the legendary neurologist at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Charcot was famous for his dramatic demonstrations of hysteria, using hypnosis to reveal the strange power of the unconscious. To Freud, Charcot was both scientist and magician, a man unafraid to probe mysteries that others dismissed as fraud or weakness. The chance to study with him was a gift. Freud departed for Paris that autumn, promising Martha that distance would not weaken his devotion. Those months in Paris changed him forever. In Charcot's lecture hall, he watched women convulse, scream, and collapse under hypnotic suggestion, their bodies staging dramas that seemed to bypass conscious will. Charcot insisted these symptoms were real, rooted not in fakery, but in the mind's hidden depths. Freud was riveted. The microscope had shown him nerve cells. Charcot showed him psychic wounds. The experience convinced him that beneath the surface of ordinary life lay forces as powerful as any disease, a conviction that would become the cornerstone of psychoanalysis. When he returned to Vienna in 1886, Freud was a different man. He married Martha at last, their years of longing finally resolved in a modest ceremony. He set up a small practice as a specialist in nervous disorders, his consulting room soon to become the laboratory of his greatest discoveries. He had left behind the laboratory slides, the eel dissections, and the failures of cocaine. Ahead lay new experiments, this time not on animals or drugs, but on the hidden recesses of the human soul. The years of love and ambition had transformed him. From a restless student in Bruck's lab, he had become a physician, a husband, and a thinker poised on the edge of discovery. He had tasted both triumph and humiliation, passion and guilt. He had discovered that knowledge was not enough, that human life, with all its longings and contradictions, could not be reduced to nerves and chemicals alone. Love had forced him into the world, Ambition had driven him to Paris, and together they had brought him to the threshold of something far greater than he or Martha could yet imagine. In the autumn of 1886, newly married and cautiously optimistic, Sigmund Freud returned to Vienna with his young wife, Martha. Their honeymoon had been brief, for Freud's finances were fragile and his ambitions pressing. He opened a small medical practice specializing in nervous disorders, hanging a modest sign outside their apartment at Berggasse 19. The rooms were simple, the furniture sparse, but for Freud, they were charged with possibility. He was no longer merely a laboratory assistant or a restless suitor. He was a physician with a household to support and a new field to explore. The patients who entered his consulting room were unlike those he had studied in Brücker's laboratory. They were not defined by lesions or visible pathology, but by symptoms that seemed to defy anatomy: paralysis without injury, blindness without damage to the eyes, uncontrollable tics and seizures without any trace in the nervous system. These cases, often women from respectable families, confounded physicians who dismissed them as malingerers or hysterics. Freud, however, was fascinated. He had seen Charcot in Paris demonstrate that such symptoms could be induced and relieved through hypnosis. Perhaps the body was staging dramas whose script was written somewhere beyond conscious awareness. It was during this period that Freud reconnected with Joseph Breuer, an older colleague and friend who had treated a remarkable patient in the early 1880s. Her name was Bertha Pappenheim, though in publications she would be disguised under the pseudonym Anna O. She had fallen mysteriously ill while caring for her dying father, developing paralysis, hallucinations, and strange disturbances of speech. Breuer discovered, almost by accident, that when she spoke freely about her symptoms, tracing them back to the emotions and memories attached, the symptoms eased. Bertha herself called it chimney sweeping. Breuer preferred the term cathartic method. Later, she would name it something more enduring, the talking cure. For Freud, the story was electric. It suggested that symptoms were not meaningless, but meaningful, that the body expressed in convulsions and paralysis what the tongue could not. Illness might be a kind of language, a code to be deciphered. He began to use similar methods with his own patients, experimenting first with hypnosis, then with encouraging them simply to speak whatever came to mind. He listened with an intensity that unsettled his patients, his dark eyes fixed, his cigar smoke curling in the lamplight as he pressed them to continue. Gradually, he discovered that when patients allowed themselves to wander into forbidden memories or fantasies, their symptoms shifted, sometimes even disappeared. By the mid-1890s, Freud had formulated his first bold theory, the seduction theory. Based on repeated testimonies from his patients, he concluded that neurosis was rooted in early childhood sexual abuse. Behind the paralysis, the coughs, the hallucinations, he heard confessions of uncles who entered bedrooms at night, fathers who crossed forbidden boundaries, family friends who betrayed trust. In 1896, he presented his findings to the Society for Psychiatry and Neurology in Vienna. Standing before an audience of eminent doctors in dark suits, he declared that hysteria could be traced not to weakness of nerves, but to trauma inflicted upon children. The reaction was icy. Respectable society recoiled at the suggestion that its own households were sites of hidden abuse. Baron Richard von Krafft-Ebing, chair of the meeting, dismissed Freud's paper as a scientific fairy tale. Referrals dried up, colleagues turned their backs, and Freud's reputation sank. He found himself increasingly isolated, his practice struggling, his friends avoiding him in the streets. Yet he persisted, convinced that he had uncovered the hidden wound at the core of mental illness. But doubts began to creep in. The stories his patients told under hypnosis Were they reliable memories or constructions shaped by suggestion? Could Vienna truly be riddled with such horrors, or was something else at work? In 1897, in a long, tortured letter to his confidant Wilhelm Fliess, Freud confessed a devastating realization: "I no longer believe in my neurotica." The seduction theory collapsed. It was a turning point, both crisis and liberation. If the patient's stories were not literal memories, then what were they? Dreams, fantasies, disguised expressions of desire and fear? Freud began to suspect that the unconscious mind did not preserve history like a ledger, but reworked it, reshaped it, disguising unbearable wishes as symptoms. The unconscious was not a passive vault of memory, but an active theater where conflicts played out in disguise. That same year, another event shook him to the core: the death of his father, Jacob Freud. The complicated man who had loomed over his childhood, proud yet humiliated, affectionate yet stern, was gone. At the funeral, as rain drummed on umbrellas, Freud felt something shift inside him. He began to dream intensely, vivid images filled with strange symbols and forgotten scenes. One dream placed him in a barber's shop with a sign that read, "You are requested to close the eyes." It seemed like a message from the grave. Freud turned his analytic gaze upon himself. In a bold and unprecedented move, he embarked on what he called self-analysis. Each morning, lying on his couch, notebook in hand, he let his thoughts drift freely, following associations wherever they led. He wrote down dreams, memories, flashes of childhood. He uncovered uncomfortable images: his childhood nurse showing him blood-stained underclothes, his mother glimpsed naked in a train compartment, the tangled mixture of love and rivalry he had felt toward his nephew John. Threaded through it all was his ambivalence toward his father: admiration, contempt, longing, disappointment. Out of this intense self-examination emerged a revolutionary idea. Dreams were not nonsense, but coded messages from the unconscious. Each dream was a wish fulfillment, though so disguised that the dreamer rarely recognized the wish. Freud dissected his own dreams layer by layer, discovering what he would call the dream work, the mechanisms by which forbidden desires were transformed into strange, fragmented images. Condensation, where multiple thoughts fused into a single symbol. Displacement, where emotion shifted from its true target to something safer. Dreams were like puzzles, their meaning hidden behind distorted shapes. By 1899, Freud gathered these insights into a book, The Interpretation of Dreams. It was dense, sprawling, filled with his own analyses, theoretical frameworks, and a bold claim that the unconscious was real, structured, and could be studied scientifically. He believed he had written a work as revolutionary as Darwin's Origin of Species. The book was met with indifference. Only 351 copies sold in its first 6 years. Critics dismissed it as speculative. Colleagues ignored it. The public shrugged. Yet Freud remained convinced. He had uncovered a hidden continent of the mind. Even if the world was not yet ready, he believed future generations would recognize what he had found. The years between 1886 and 1897 had been a crucible. Freud had built a practice, risked ridicule, lost faith in one theory, and discovered another. He had turned his gaze inward, and in doing so uncovered the unconscious as a dynamic force shaping every thought, dream, and symptom. From the ashes of the seduction theory rose something far more radical: the notion that we are strangers to ourselves, governed by hidden wishes and fears. The talking cure, born in the confessions of Bertha Pappenheim and refined in Freud's own self-analysis, had revealed itself as more than therapy. It was a doorway into the deepest chambers of the human soul. By the late 1890s, Sigmund Freud stood at a crossroads. His practice in Vienna continued modestly, but his reputation remained fragile. The seduction theory had collapsed under the weight of doubt, and with it the thin support he had once enjoyed among colleagues. He was alone, professionally marginalized, with only a handful of loyal patients and a growing pile of notebooks filled with strange speculations. Yet in that isolation, something remarkable occurred. Freud turned inward, and in doing so, he discovered a universe within himself. The death of his father in 1896 was the catalyst. Jakob Freud had been a complicated presence. Stern but affectionate, a man whose failures in business had shadowed his family, but whose pride as a Jew had given young Sigmund a sense of dignity. His passing struck Freud with an intensity that surprised him. The grief was tangled with guilt, resentment, and longing. He found himself haunted not only by memories, but by dreams so vivid and unsettling that he felt compelled to analyze them. Thus began his self-analysis, a project unprecedented in the history of medicine. Each night, Freud recorded his dreams. Each morning, he dissected them as if they were specimens under his microscope. But unlike crayfish nerves or eel gonads, these specimens were alive, slippery, and resistant. He pursued them with the same relentless energy he had once devoted to neurophysiology. But now the field of study was his own unconscious. What emerged was unsettling. Dreams of his mother appeared with startling frequency, images of her body, sometimes erotic, sometimes terrifying. Dreams of his father recurred as well, alternately stern and helpless, embodying the contradictions of admiration and contempt that Freud felt. One dream placed him in a barber's shop with a sign that read, "You are requested to close the eyes." It seemed to echo from the grave, an injunction to both mourn and confront what lay hidden. Freud also began to revisit childhood scenes with uncomfortable clarity. His Catholic nursemaid, who had once filled his mind with stories of saints and demons, returned in memory, now linked with fragments of sexual curiosity and forbidden glimpses. His rivalry with his nephew John, his confusing mix of love and hostility, resurfaced with symbolic weight. Freud pursued these associations ruthlessly, convinced that the unconscious disguised its truths in riddles, symbols, and distortions. It was during this period that Freud formulated his most radical hypothesis, that dreams are wish fulfillments. Every dream, he argued, no matter how bizarre, was the disguised realization of a desire. Some wishes were obvious, longings for food, love, or success, but others were forbidden, repressed, unacceptable to the waking self. These emerged in dreams only in disguise, transformed by what Freud called the dream work. Condensation fused multiple ideas into a single symbol. Displacement shifted emotional intensity from one figure to another. Secondary revision smoothed the narrative into a semblance of coherence. The dream, he concluded, was not random noise, but a coded message from the unconscious. His analysis of the dream of Irma's injection became a cornerstone of this theory. In the dream, a patient named Irma suffers complications from a treatment. As Freud examined her, colleagues appeared, and blame shifted from him to them. The dream, he realized, was not about Irma at all, but about his own wish to be absolved of responsibility, to justify himself in the face of criticism. The surface content was medical, the latent meaning was deeply personal. This, Freud argued, was how all dreams functioned, as theaters where the unconscious staged its hidden desires. From these explorations grew the conviction that the unconscious was not merely a repository of forgotten memories, but a dynamic, conflict-ridden realm where forbidden wishes battled against moral prohibitions. Civilization itself, Freud would later argue, rested on repression, but in the privacy of dreams, the repressed returned. Night after night, the unconscious spoke in symbols, slips, and disguises. In 1899, Freud completed the manuscript of his magnum opus, Die Traumdeutung, the interpretation of dreams. He believed it to be as revolutionary as Darwin's Origin of Species, a book that would transform not just psychiatry, but humanity's understanding of itself. The work was sprawling, over 600 pages, blending case studies, autobiographical fragments, theoretical frameworks, and bold proclamations. It introduced concepts that would become foundational: the unconscious, repression, wish fulfillment, dream work. Freud believed he had mapped the hidden continent of the mind. The reception was disheartening. Published in late 1899, with the date 1900 on its cover, as if to mark the beginning of a new century, the book sold poorly. Only 351 copies left the shelves in its first 6 years. Critics dismissed it as speculative, colleagues ignored it. Friends urged Freud to return to more conventional medicine. For a time, it seemed that his great discovery would sink without trace. But Freud was undeterred. He told himself that the book was written for the future, not the present. "The value of the work," he wrote, "will only be recognized later." He was right. Slowly, a handful of readers began to grasp its significance. A small circle of younger physicians, intrigued by his ideas, sought him out. Together, they formed the beginnings of a movement that would eventually transform Freud from an isolated figure into the founder of a new discipline, psychoanalysis. Between 1897 and 1900, Freud had descended into the depths of his own mind and emerged with a map of the unconscious. It was not a clean or comforting vision. It revealed humans as divided beings, driven by desires they barely acknowledged, haunted by memories they could not fully recall, and betrayed by their own slips of the tongue. But for Freud, it was the truth, and he believed that truth, however unsettling, was worth any cost. At the dawn of the 20th century, Sigmund Freud was a man both exhilarated and isolated. His interpretation of dreams lay largely ignored on the shelves of Viennese bookstores, a heavy tome that even his closest colleagues struggled to finish. Yet Freud himself was convinced that he had cracked open a door into a hidden chamber of the human mind. The years that followed, from 1900 to 1905, were a time of expansion, when he moved beyond dreams and began to sketch the broad architecture of the psyche itself. These were the years in which he mapped the unconscious as a living system, introduced the notion of repression, and dared to claim that childhood, long considered innocent, was in fact a theater of desire. His consulting room at Berggasse 19 became both laboratory and stage. Patients came not with visible wounds, but with symptoms that seemed to have no physical basis: paralyses, phobias, compulsions, inexplicable anxieties. Freud, abandoning hypnosis, refined a new method: free association. Patients were asked to recline on a couch, their gaze away from the doctor, and speak whatever came to mind, no matter how trivial, shameful, or absurd. Freud listened with what he called evenly suspended attention, resisting the urge to guide or interrupt. The technique was deceptively simple, but in practice, it opened doors. Words spilled out in tangents and slips, revealing the unconscious in fragments, much like dreams had done. From these sessions, Freud crystallized the concept of repression. When a thought, memory, or impulse was too disturbing to acknowledge, the mind did not simply forget it. It actively pushed it out of awareness, banishing it into the unconscious. But repression was never complete. The exiled material returned in distorted forms, as dreams, slips of the tongue, neurotic symptoms. The unconscious was not a passive storehouse, but an active, restless force, always pressing against the barriers that sought to contain it. This insight carried unsettling implications. If the unconscious governed so much of human life, Then reason and will were not masters in their own house. Civilization itself rested precariously on repression, and beneath its polished surface, primitive forces surged. To admit this was to challenge the cherished belief that humans were rational creatures in control of themselves. Freud's vision was darker. We are, at best, interpreters of forces that lie beyond our conscious reach. The boldest and most scandalous of Freud's claims in these years concerned infantile sexuality. Against the prevailing notion of childhood innocence, Freud argued that from birth, humans are driven by pleasure-seeking energies, later called libido. He described development in stages: the oral stage, where the mouth is the first site of satisfaction; the anal stage, marked by the pleasures of retention and release; and the phallic stage, where children discover their genitals and experience complex desires toward their parents. These stages, Freud claimed, left lasting marks on personality. If a child became fixated at one stage, unresolved conflicts could echo through adulthood as quirks, anxieties, or neuroses. At the center of this theory lay the Oedipus complex, perhaps Freud's most infamous idea. Borrowing from Greek tragedy, he proposed that every little boy unconsciously desires his mother and sees his father as a rival. The resolution of this conflict, through fear of castration and eventual identification with the father, was, Freud argued, the foundation of morality and adult identity. For girls, the process was more obscure, but he suggested that a parallel dynamic unfolded, driven by what he controversially termed penis envy. These claims horrified respectable society. To suggest that children harbored sexual wishes was not only shocking but obscene, yet Freud pressed forward, convinced that the scandal was proof of how deeply repression ran. Freud's writings from this period pushed beyond clinical notes into broader culture. In The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, 1901, he argued that slips of the tongue, bungled actions, and forgetfulness were not random accidents, but meaningful expressions of the unconscious. A man forgetting a friend's name, a woman misplacing her umbrella, a politician tripping over words, all revealed hidden wishes and fears. The book was playful in tone, filled with examples from his own life, but its implications were radical. If even trivial mistakes were shaped by the unconscious, then nothing in human behavior was accidental. By 1905, Freud published 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, perhaps his most controversial work. He claimed that sexuality was not confined to adulthood or reproduction, but permeated the entire span of life. Children, he argued, were sexual beings, experimenting with pleasure long before puberty. Society demanded repression, but the price of repression was neurosis. The essays scandalized readers, yet they also established Freud as a thinker who could not be ignored. The professional response remained cautious at best, hostile at worst. Many colleagues dismissed him as obsessed with sex, reducing everything to erotic drives. Patients came and went, some grateful, others disturbed. Freud himself grew increasingly isolated from mainstream medicine. Yet a small group of younger doctors began to gather around him, intrigued by his daring ideas. They met in his study on Wednesday evenings, sipping black coffee and smoking cigars, discussing cases and theories late into the night. What began as a handful of followers would soon become the psychoanalytic movement. Privately, Freud was restless. His health, already fragile, was strained by relentless work and constant smoking. His finances remained precarious, though his practice provided modest stability. He was devoted to his growing family. 6 children now filled the Freud household, but his true passion lay in his manuscripts, where he wrestled with the forces of desire, repression, and the unconscious. His evenings were often spent pacing the study, dictating to his loyal secretary or scribbling revisions until dawn. These years forged the foundation of psychoanalysis. Freud had moved from the cathartic method to free association, from isolated case studies to sweeping theories of culture. He had charted the terrain of the unconscious, introduced repression as its gatekeeper, and unveiled infantile sexuality as the engine of development. He had scandalized society, alienated colleagues, and inspired disciples. Above all, he had transformed the understanding of human nature. To map the psyche, Freud argued, was to confront uncomfortable truths, that we are driven by desires we do not acknowledge, shaped by childhood conflicts we barely remember, and betrayed daily by slips and symptoms we cannot control. It was not a flattering picture of humanity, but Freud believed it was honest, and honesty, however disturbing, was the first step toward liberation. On Wednesday evenings in Vienna, when most respectable families settled into routines of supper and prayer, a small but unusual gathering took place in the apartment of Sigmund Freud at Berggasse 19. The setting was modest, a living room crowded with chairs, cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling, coffee poured into chipped porcelain cups. Around the table sat a handful of young doctors, restless intellectuals, and curious outsiders. They were drawn not by social pleasantries, but by Freud's bold ideas, which even then hovered on the margins of respectability. This group would later be called the Wednesday Psychological Society, though at the time it felt more like a conspiratorial club than a professional institution. At the head of the circle was Freud himself, already in his mid-40s, stern yet animated, his heavy beard giving him the aura of a patriarch. He set the tone, critical, intense, but not without humor. He expected loyalty but welcomed debate, at least within certain bounds. The evenings unfolded in a ritual. A member presented a case or a paper, after which the group dissected it with relentless scrutiny. Freud listened intently, cigar in hand, interjecting with sharp remarks, challenging assumptions, guiding the discussion back to the principles he was forging. The atmosphere was charged, sometimes combative, often exhilarating. The earliest members included Wilhelm Steckel, an energetic physician fascinated by dreams and symbolism, Alfred Adler, whose sharp intelligence and independent streak would later set him apart, and Otto Rank, who began as Freud's secretary but quickly became one of his most devoted disciples. They were joined by others, Hans Sachs, Max Kahane, Rudolf Reitler, each bringing enthusiasm, each eager to be close to the man they saw as a pioneer. For these young men, Freud's study was a world apart. In the medical establishment, Freud was dismissed as eccentric, even dangerous. His emphasis on sexuality, his insistence that childhood desires shaped adult life, provoked ridicule. But within the Wednesday circle, the rules were different. Here they spoke openly about taboos, masturbation, incest, perversions, dreams filled with erotic symbolism. They challenged one another without restraint, emboldened by the sense that they were participants in a revolution of thought. Freud relished these evenings. After years of professional isolation, he finally had an audience, an echo chamber that amplified his ideas, refined them, tested them against the minds of others. He referred to his followers as his sons, casting himself as the intellectual father of a new generation. They, in turn, treated him with a mixture of admiration and awe, sometimes bordering on reverence. To sit in Freud's study was to be part of something clandestine and momentous, as though they were conspirators preparing to unveil secrets that would shake the world. It was within this circle that Freud's theories began to crystallize into a movement. Members debated not only case histories, but also broader cultural phenomena, myths, literature, religion. They applied psychoanalysis to Greek tragedies, biblical stories, even Shakespeare. To them, the unconscious was not limited to patients in the consulting room, but could be traced in the great works of human imagination. The Oedipus complex, repression, dream symbolism, These concepts were discussed with a fervor that blurred the line between science and art, therapy and philosophy. As the group expanded, tensions emerged. Some members sought to broaden psychoanalysis beyond Freud's formulations, while others clung more rigidly to his authority. Wilhelm Stekel, brilliant but erratic, fascinated Freud at first, but later disturbed him with his unorthodox methods and mystical leanings. Alfred Adler displayed a growing independence, emphasizing feelings of inferiority and the drive for power rather than Freud's focus on sexual desire. Freud tolerated dissent to a point, but beneath the surface, his need for control simmered. The circle was his creation, and he intended to remain its center. Beyond Vienna, Freud's ideas began to find footholds. In Zurich, at the Burg Hölzli Psychiatric Hospital, a young Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Gustav Jung took an interest in psychoanalysis. Jung, handsome and ambitious, was experimenting with word association tests that seemed to confirm Freud's theories of unconscious conflict. In 1907, he traveled to Vienna and met Freud in person. Their first conversation lasted 13 hours without pause, a marathon of intensity that left both men convinced they had found an ally. Freud saw in Jung not only a brilliant mind, but a strategic heir, young, Protestant, Swiss, and thus free of the stigma of Jewish marginality that limited Freud's influence. Jung, in turn, felt electrified by Freud's charisma and the boldness of his theories. The arrival of Jung injected new energy into the movement. Within a year, the Wednesday Circle evolved into something larger, the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Journals were founded, lectures organized, alliances built. What had begun as a small group of exiles in Freud's apartment was now becoming an international network, with Jung as the crown prince, poised to bring psychoanalysis into the mainstream of European science. Freud watched this expansion with satisfaction, tinged by anxiety. He had long dreamed of disciples, of a movement that would outlive him, but he also feared dilution, misinterpretation, betrayal. His authority was immense within the circle, but cracks were already visible. Rivalries simmered, loyalties shifted, and beneath the camaraderie lay a tension that would one day tear the movement apart. For now, however, the Wednesday Circle marked a triumph. Freud, once ridiculed and ignored, was no longer alone. Around his table gathered men who spoke his language, shared his convictions, and believed they were at the frontier of a new science of the mind. Vienna, with its coffee houses and concert halls, remained largely indifferent. But in Freud's smoky study, week after week, the unconscious was being charted, theory by theory, case by case. It was the beginning of psychoanalysis as a collective endeavor. And though Freud remained the patriarch, the circle itself was already becoming more than its founder, a movement, a community, a force that would soon spread beyond Vienna's narrow streets into the wider world. When Carl Gustav Jung first entered Freud's world, he seemed to embody everything the older man had been waiting for. Tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing eyes and a calm authority, Jung carried himself with the confidence of a man destined for leadership. Unlike Freud, who bore the scars of lifelong marginalization as a Jew in Vienna, Jung was Swiss, Protestant, and socially unmarked by prejudice. He moved easily in academic circles that remained closed to Freud. More than that, he was young, barely in his 30s, bursting with energy and ambition. To Freud, Jung appeared not merely as a disciple, but as the heir who could carry psychoanalysis into the mainstream of European science. Their first meeting in 1907 had been legendary. Jung traveled from Zurich to Vienna, arriving at Burgast 19 with anticipation. Freud greeted him warmly, and the two men began talking, first about word association experiments, then about dreams, myths, and the hidden life of the mind. Hours passed. Lunch came and went. The conversation continued into the evening, then deep into the night. By the time they stopped, more than 13 hours had elapsed. Both men felt as though destiny had introduced them. Freud confided to friends that Jung was the crown prince of psychoanalysis. Jung wrote to colleagues that he had found in Freud a father figure of unmatched brilliance. For several years, the alliance flourished. Jung's position at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich gave Freud's theories an institutional foothold. Patients subjected to word association tests revealed unconscious conflicts that seemed to confirm Freud's ideas about repression. Jung published supportive papers, organized lectures, and defended Freud against critics. In 1909, the two men traveled together to America, invited to lecture at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. On the ship across the Atlantic, they shared stories, jokes, and interpretations of dreams. For Freud, who had long been ignored in Vienna, the warm reception in America was intoxicating. The lecture halls were packed. Students leaned forward eagerly, and journalists hailed him as a revolutionary thinker. Standing beside him, Jung drew applause as well. Psychoanalysis, once confined to smoky rooms in Vienna, had become an international sensation. Yet beneath the camaraderie, tensions began to stir. Freud, ever vigilant about authority, expected loyalty from his disciples. Jung, fiercely independent, bristled under the paternal mantle. The deeper the theory delved into sexuality, the more uncomfortable Jung became. He admired Freud's insights, but believed that libido could not be reduced to sexual energy alone. For Jung, it was a broader, more spiritual life force, shaping creativity, religion, and myth. Freud, in contrast, insisted on the primacy of sexuality. To dilute it, he warned, was to weaken the foundation of psychoanalysis. Their correspondence reveals the growing strain. Freud's letters were filled with admonitions. "Do not deviate from the central truth," he urged. Jung's replies, polite but firm, pushed back, "There are other forces at work in the human soul." The father-son dynamic that had initially bonded them now became suffocating. Jung felt Freud's authority as a weight. Freud felt Jung's independence as betrayal. The break came gradually, like the slow cracking of ice. In 1910, when the International Psychoanalytical Association was founded, Freud ensured that Jung was elected its first president. It was a strategic choice. Jung's Protestant identity and institutional status would shield psychoanalysis from charges of being a Jewish science. Yet this very reasoning irritated Jung, who resented being chosen for political expediency rather than intellectual merit. "I am not your fig leaf," he thought, though he kept the words private. By 1912, the theoretical divergence had become irreconcilable. Jung published Psychology of the Unconscious, in which he reinterpreted Freud's concepts in terms of archetypes, symbols, and the collective unconscious. Sexuality was only one thread in a much larger tapestry. Freud was incensed. To him, Jung's revisions were not enrichment, but dilution, a betrayal of the hard-won truths that had defined psychoanalysis. In a furious letter, Freud accused Jung of abandoning science for mysticism. Jung, equally angry, accused Freud of dogmatism, of reducing every mystery to sex. The rupture was not only intellectual but deeply personal. For years, Jung had looked to Freud as a father figure, while Freud had seen Jung as the son who would secure his legacy. Their letters reveal the emotional weight of the split: reproaches, pleas, bitter accusations. Freud collapsed once during a heated discussion, fainting dramatically, as if his body itself protested the conflict. Jung interpreted the feint as a manipulative gesture, a way of silencing dissent. Their trust, once so complete, had dissolved into suspicion. By 1913, the break was final. Jung resigned as president of the International Psychoanalytical Association. Freud, wounded and furious, denounced him publicly, severing all ties. What had begun with 13 hours of passionate conversation ended in silence. Freud's movement lost its crown prince, and Jung struck out on his own, building an alternative psychology centered on archetypes and the collective unconscious. The psychoanalytic family had fractured, and the wound would never fully heal. For Freud, the rupture was devastating but also clarifying. It confirmed his suspicion that disciples could not be trusted, that psychoanalysis must remain firmly under his control. Yet it also deepened his isolation, narrowing his circle to those willing to follow him without question. For Jung, the break was liberating, allowing him to pursue his own path. But for the history of psychology, it marked a schism that would define the field for generations. The story of Freud and Jung remains one of the great intellectual dramas of the modern age. A father and son in spirit, bound by admiration, undone by ambition, divided by theory, and haunted by the ghosts of loyalty and betrayal. What began as an alliance of minds became a parable of the unconscious itself. Love, rivalry, repression, and the inevitability of conflict. After the break with Jung, Freud stood more alone than ever before, but the years surrounding 1905 to 1914 were also among his most productive. Out of his isolation emerged a series of case studies that would become legendary, as well as bold forays into the realms of literature, myth, and religion. These works established psychoanalysis not merely as a medical specialty, but as a sweeping theory of culture itself. The case histories came first, published in a series of monographs that combined clinical detail with narrative drama. Freud wrote them almost as short stories, giving his patients pseudonyms but preserving their struggles with startling intimacy. Perhaps the most famous was Dora, a young woman who came to him suffering from coughing fits, fainting spells, and a refusal to speak. Through free association and careful probing, Freud concluded that Dora's symptoms were linked to a tangle of family secrets, her father's affair with another woman, her own conflicted feelings toward the woman's husband, and the storm of unconscious desires and resentments swirling around them. The case ended abruptly when Dora quit treatment, frustrated by Freud's interpretations. Yet Freud published it nonetheless, convinced that even in its failure, it revealed the mechanisms of hysteria. Then came the Rat Man, a young lawyer tormented by obsessive fears that his father and beloved might be subjected to a horrific torture involving rats. The imagery was grotesque, but Freud traced it back to unconscious conflicts: guilt, ambivalence toward authority, and repressed desires. By unraveling the associations, Freud showed how obsessional neurosis could transform forbidden wishes into elaborate rituals of thought and fear. The Ratman's case became a model for understanding compulsions not as madness, but as logic gone awry under the pressure of repression. The Wolfman followed, a Russian aristocrat plagued by terrifying dreams of wolves staring at him from a tree. Through painstaking analysis, Freud argued that the dream represented a primal scene of the boy witnessing his parents' intercourse, repressed into symbolic form. The interpretation was controversial, even among Freud's followers, but it displayed his conviction that the unconscious spoke in symbols as profound as any myth. And then there was little Hans, a 5-year-old boy who developed a crippling fear of horses. Freud, working indirectly through correspondence with the boy's father, interpreted the phobia as a displaced fear of his father during the resolution of the Oedipus complex. Hans loved his mother, feared his father's retaliation, and transferred that fear onto horses with large, threatening mouths. The case seemed to confirm Freud's theories of infantile sexuality and the Oedipus complex in dramatic fashion. These case histories were not just clinical reports, they were literary events. Freud wrote with narrative flair, shaping his patients' stories into parables of unconscious life. Critics accused him of imposing theory onto fragile lives, of turning therapy into allegory. But admirers marveled at the depth of his insights, the way he drew meaning from symptoms that others dismissed as nonsense. For Freud, each patient was both an individual and a window into universal truths about desire, repression, and the human condition. At the same time, Freud extended psychoanalysis beyond the consulting room into the realm of culture. In Delusion and Dream in Jensen's Gradiva, 1907, he analyzed a novel about an archaeologist obsessed with a woman who resembled an ancient bas-relief. Freud argued that the story dramatized repression and desire, showing how literature itself could be read like a dream. In Leonardo da Vinci and A Memory of His Childhood, 1910, he explored the artist's creativity through psychoanalysis, interpreting Leonardo's notebooks and a childhood fantasy as evidence of sublimated desire. The book was part biography, part analysis, part bold speculation, an example of Freud's conviction that art and science shared the same roots in unconscious life. Religion, too, came under his scrutiny. In essays and lectures, Freud suggested that religious rituals resembled neurotic compulsions, expressions of guilt and fear disguised as piety. The idea shocked believers but resonated with skeptics. Myths, he argued, were collective dreams, symbolic narratives that expressed repressed desires of entire cultures. The Oedipus myth in particular, he saw as confirmation of the unconscious dynamics he had uncovered in his patients. This period also saw the founding of institutions to carry psychoanalysis into the world. The International Psychoanalytical Association, despite the schism with Jung, grew in membership. Journals were launched, congresses convened, and Freud's circle expanded beyond Vienna to Berlin, Budapest, London, and New York. Yet tensions simmered as disciples vied for authority and interpretations diverged. Freud, ever protective of his creation, insisted on fidelity to the central principles: the unconscious, repression, infantile sexuality, and the Oedipus complex. Those who strayed too far were quietly pushed aside. Personally, Freud remained tireless. He continued to see patients daily, often working from early morning until late at night. He smoked his cigars constantly, ignoring the persistent cough that would one day signal more serious illness. He wrote in bursts of energy, producing books and essays with astonishing regularity. His children grew around him, Anna, his youngest, already showing the sharpness of mind that would one day make her his intellectual heir. The household at Burgas 19 was crowded, noisy, filled with the everyday chaos of family life. Yet within his study, Freud carved a sanctuary where the unconscious was mapped like new territory. By 1914, Freud stood at the center of a movement that was both triumphant and embattled. Psychoanalysis had grown from a handful of Wednesday evening meetings into an international phenomenon. Its vocabulary, repression, complex, unconscious, had entered the cultural lexicon. Yet its founder remained controversial, admired by some, reviled by others, surrounded by disciples who were as much rivals as allies. The case histories and cultural essays of this decade revealed the dual ambition of Freud's project: to heal individual suffering and to interpret civilization itself. He believed the same forces that produced hysteria in Dora or obsession in the Ratman also shaped myths, art, and religion. The unconscious was not a private quirk, but a universal dimension of human life. To understand it was to unlock both personal neurosis and collective culture. It was a grand vision, audacious and unsettling. And as Europe inched toward the catastrophe of the First World War, Freud's theories of hidden conflict, repression, and aggression would soon resonate in ways he himself had not anticipated. When the guns of August 1914 thundered across Europe, Sigmund Freud was 58 years old, entering what should have been the twilight of a scholar's career. Instead, the Great War ripped through the world he had spent decades analyzing, shattering illusions not only of politics and empire but of human nature itself. The optimism of the early psychoanalytic movement, with its confident talk of progress and enlightenment, gave way to something darker. For Freud, the war confirmed what he had long suspected. Beneath the thin veneer of civilization lurked destructive forces, older and more powerful than reason. Vienna, once a glittering capital of cafes, music, and intellectual exchange, transformed almost overnight. Soldiers filled the streets, newspapers overflowed with patriotic slogans, and families bade farewell to sons who would never return. 3 of Freud's own boys enlisted. Ernst, his second son, was sent to the Italian front where the conditions were brutal. Letters from the trenches carried not only descriptions of mud and hunger, but also the unspoken fear of death. Freud, outwardly stoic, read them with dread, his hand trembling as he folded the paper. The war reached into his consulting room as well. Patients arrived not only with neuroses rooted in childhood, but with fresh traumas inflicted by the battlefield. Soldiers returned shattered, trembling uncontrollably, unable to speak, plagued by nightmares of exploding shells and mangled bodies. The medical establishment called it shell shock, often dismissing it as cowardice. Freud recognized something different, the mind overwhelmed, repression collapsing under the weight of horror. Here was trauma on a scale that dwarfed his case histories, trauma so vast that it seemed to confirm his belief that repression was the fragile cornerstone of mental life. Freud's writings during the war years reflect a growing pessimism. In 1915, he composed essays later collected as Thoughts for the Times on War and Death. In them, he rejected the naive belief that civilization had tamed humanity's instincts. The war, he argued, had stripped away the mask, revealing aggression, cruelty, and destruction as essential parts of human nature. He spoke of the disillusionment of war, the collapse of faith in progress, the revelation that the same cultured nations who produced Beethoven and Goethe could also unleash slaughter on an industrial scale. The war years also strained the psychoanalytic movement. Many of Freud's followers were drafted, scattered across Europe, some never to return. Meetings of the International Psychoanalytical Association became impossible. Correspondence slowed, journals ceased publication, yet in the quiet of his study, Freud continued to write, his mind gnawing at questions larger than ever before. In 1917, amidst shortages and rationing, Freud delivered a series of lectures known as introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. Despite the chaos of war, audiences flocked to hear him. In packed halls, he spoke of dreams, slips, and repression, translating the complex machinery of the unconscious into vivid examples. Students scribbled notes furiously, while older physicians listened with a mix of fascination and suspicion. The lectures brought him fame beyond his circle of disciples, transforming him into a public intellectual. Yet Freud himself was far from triumphant. Privately, he wrestled with a new and unsettling thought. Perhaps the unconscious was not driven solely by the pursuit of pleasure, but also by a compulsion toward destruction. This idea crystallized after the war, as Freud observed patients whose symptoms seemed to resist explanation by the pleasure principle. Soldiers traumatized by combat relived their nightmares again and again, as if compelled to return to suffering rather than avoid it. Children played repetitive games that seemed to reenact loss rather than seek joy. Freud began to suspect that beneath the drive for pleasure and survival lay a deeper instinct, one that sought not life but its undoing. In 1920, he gave this intuition its most provocative form in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. The book shocked even his closest followers. Here Freud introduced the concept of the death drive, or thanatos, a fundamental instinct that pulled organisms toward destruction, repetition, and a return to inorganic stillness. Life, he argued, was not only the struggle for survival and reproduction, but also a struggle with its opposite, a yearning for dissolution, for the quiet of death. Alongside Eros, the drive for love and creation, stood this darker twin, always present, always in conflict. The death drive was perhaps Freud's most controversial idea. Some dismissed it as the product of wartime gloom, a philosopher's melancholy disguised as science. Others saw it as his most profound insight, explaining not only trauma, but also war, cruelty, and self-destructive behavior. Freud himself admitted its speculative nature, calling it a mythology of instincts. Yet he could not ignore what the war had revealed, that humanity was drawn to destruction as inexorably as to love. Personally, the war years were hard. Freud's health declined. His beloved daughter Sophie died suddenly in 1920 of influenza, leaving him devastated. The loss of a child, he wrote, seems to be a wound that will never close. He worked on Beyond the Pleasure Principle through his grief, channeling sorrow into theory. Death was no longer an abstraction. It sat at his own table, a guest that would not depart. The years 1914 to 1920 marked a transformation in Freud's thought. He moved from the hopeful exploration of dreams and sexuality to a darker vision in which civilization itself appeared fragile, haunted by instincts of destruction. The case studies of Dora, the Rat Man, and Little Hans gave way to the larger case study of humanity at war. Out of the trenches and funeral parlors, Freud distilled a theory that placed death at the heart of life. It was not a comforting conclusion. But Freud had never sought comfort. He sought truth, however unsettling. And in the wake of the Great War, truth seemed to demand acknowledgement that the same unconscious that produced love, art, and civilization also harbored the impulse to tear it all down. The 1920s arrived as both triumph and torment for Sigmund Freud. On the one hand, he had become a figure of international renown, his name synonymous with the hidden depths of the mind. On the other, his body betrayed him, piece by piece, as illness encroached. These years were marked by a cruel paradox. While his ideas reached further than ever before, Freud himself grew weaker, beset by pain, loss, and the knowledge that time was running short. The most relentless of his afflictions was cancer of the jaw, first diagnosed in 1923. Decades of cigar smoking, those ever-present companions of his study, had left their mark. A small lesion on his palate turned out to be malignant. Surgery followed, brutal and imprecise by modern standards. Portions of his jawbone were removed, replaced with a cumbersome prosthesis he nicknamed the Monster. Eating became painful, speaking an ordeal. He endured dozens of operations over the next 16 years, each one leaving him more scarred, his face distorted, his endurance tested. Yet Freud refused pity. He continued to work, dictating, writing, even seeing patients when he could. "I am a man," he told friends, "who has been marked by fate, but not defeated by it." Amid his physical suffering, Freud's intellectual influence blossomed. Psychoanalysis spread across Europe and America. In Berlin, Max Eitingon and Karl Abraham established training institutes. In Budapest, Sándor Ferenczi championed new therapeutic techniques. In New York, young psychiatrists imported his ideas into hospitals and universities. Journals flourished, conferences convened, and the once marginal theory of the unconscious became a global movement. Freud, though too ill to travel, followed these developments with satisfaction. Letters poured in from disciples and critics alike, testifying that psychoanalysis had become a force in medicine, literature, and philosophy. But fame brought distortions. Simplified versions of Freud's theories entered popular culture. Newspapers joked about Oedipus complexes and Freudian slips. Cartoonists depicted couches and bearded doctors. Critics accused Freud of reducing everything to sex, while admirers hailed him as a prophet of self-knowledge. Freud himself was ambivalent. He wanted recognition but feared vulgarization. To Ernest Jones, his loyal biographer and disciple, he complained, "They repeat my ideas without grasping their method." Yet deep down he knew this was inevitable. Once released into the world, his concepts took on lives of their own. The decade was also shadowed by grief. In 1920, as Europe staggered from the war, Freud's beloved daughter Sophie died suddenly of influenza at the age of 26. The news struck him with unbearable force. He confessed to friends that he felt paralyzed, unable to write for weeks. In his journal, he scribbled, "The death of a child seems to annihilate the future." 2 years later, Sophie's son, Freud's grandson, died of tuberculosis. The double blow deepened his reflections on mortality and loss. His theory of the death drive, once speculative, now felt painfully real. Yet Freud's mind never ceased probing. In 1927, he published The Future of an Illusion, a scathing analysis of religion. He argued that faith was a collective neurosis, a projection of infantile wishes for a protective father. Gods were illusions born of fear, comfort for a species unable to face reality. The book provoked outrage among believers, but also admiration among skeptics who saw in Freud a fearless truth-teller. Even more influential was his 1930 essay, Civilization and Its Discontents. Here, Freud synthesized decades of reflection into a bleak vision of human life. Civilization, he argued, was built upon repression. To live together, humans had to curb their instincts, sexual, aggressive, selfish, but the cost of repression was discontent, guilt, frustration, neurosis. One feels inclined to say, Freud wrote, that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. The essay resonated with a generation that had survived war and faced political upheaval. It presented civilization not as triumph, but as compromise, always fragile, always at risk of collapse under the weight of the instincts it suppressed. Meanwhile, Freud's family life continued in its peculiar balance of closeness and distance. Martha, his wife, managed the household quietly, her role steady but largely invisible in his writings. His children grew into adults, some distant, others entwined with his work. Most devoted was Anna Freud, his youngest daughter, who became his constant companion and eventually the leading figure of child psychoanalysis. She cared for him tenderly through surgeries and illnesses, while also forging her own career as a theorist and therapist. Their bond was profound, blurring lines between filial devotion and intellectual partnership. To friends, it seemed as though Anna had become the guardian of both Freud's body and his legacy. Politically, the world around him darkened. Austria, in the 1920s and early 1930s, was caught between fragile democracy and rising extremism. Freud, though not deeply engaged in politics, observed with alarm the surge of anti-Semitism and authoritarianism. He knew well that his position as a Jewish intellectual was precarious. Yet he continued to work, convinced that the battle for truth was waged not in parliaments, but in the depths of the mind. By the early 1930s, Freud was both revered and embattled, frail yet unyielding. He had endured cancer, buried his daughter, seen his theories distorted and celebrated. He had written books that stripped illusions from religion, art, and civilization itself. His study at Berggasse 19 remained a sanctuary. Shelves crowded with antiquities, the famous couch draped in Persian rugs, the air thick with cigar smoke. Visitors were struck by the intensity of his presence, even in illness. He spoke slowly, his words carefully chosen, but his eyes still burned with the old fire. The years 1920 to 1933 etched Freud's paradox into history, a man physically broken yet intellectually triumphant, a thinker who dismantled illusions even as he endured pain and loss. He had shown that civilization was fragile, that happiness was fleeting, that repression was the price of culture. These were not comforting truths, but Freud never sought comfort. He sought clarity. And in the midst of illness and fame, he gave the 20th century one of its most unsettling mirrors. The 1930s descended on Vienna with a gathering darkness. The city of Freud's maturity, once a vibrant center of music, cafes, and intellectual ferment, now trembled under the march of authoritarianism. The rise of fascism in Europe was no distant rumor. It pressed against the very doors of Berggasse 19. For Sigmund Freud, already weakened by cancer, the final chapter of his life would unfold against a backdrop of political terror and personal endurance. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, and psychoanalysis was immediately targeted as a Jewish science. Freud's books were burned in public bonfires, flames devouring the very volumes that had once unsettled polite society. "What progress we are making," Freud remarked with his characteristic irony. "In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now, they are content with burning my books." Yet beneath the dark humor lay unease. The tide of hatred was rising, and Vienna, with its own deep traditions of anti-Semitism, offered no refuge. By 1938, the threat became unbearable. On March 12th, German troops entered Austria in the Anschluss, and Vienna was absorbed into the Third Reich. Within days, the Freud household was under scrutiny. Nazi officers appeared at Berggasse 19, seizing passports, questioning family members, intimidating visitors. Freud's books were confiscated, his daughter Anna briefly detained by the Gestapo. Friends urged him to flee immediately, yet Freud, stubborn and proud, hesitated. He was 82 years old, ravaged by surgeries, bound to his home filled with antiquities and memories. To abandon Vienna was to abandon the life he had built. It was Anna who pressed hardest, insisting they must leave. With the intervention of foreign admirers, including Princess Marie Bonaparte of Greece, arrangements were made for Freud and his family to escape. The negotiations were tense, the bribes exorbitant, but by June 1938, the Freuds boarded a train to Paris and then crossed to London. As the train pulled away from Vienna, Freud gazed out the window, silent, his mind heavy with resignation. He left behind not only his city, but also 4 of his sisters, who would later perish in Nazi concentration camps. London welcomed him with respect, if not comfort. The Freuds settled in a house at 20 Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead, which quickly became a new shrine of psychoanalysis. Visitors described the rooms as almost identical to Berggasse 19, filled with the same shelves of books and the same collection of antiquities, Egyptian statues, Greek figurines, Chinese vases. Even the famous couch had been transported, draped in its familiar Persian rugs. Yet Freud himself was diminished, his body frail, his speech slurred by the prosthesis in his jaw. He continued to see a few patients, but his strength was ebbing. Despite his pain, Freud's mind remained sharp. In London, he completed his final book, Moses and Monotheism, 1939, a provocative and unsettling work in which he argued that Moses had been an Egyptian who imposed monotheism on the Hebrews, and that religion itself was born of repression and guilt. It was a daring act of intellectual defiance, written as Europe slid once more into war. Critics dismissed it, admirers puzzled over it, but Freud saw it as his last testament, a fusion of archaeology, history, and psychoanalysis, reflecting his lifelong quest to unmask illusions. His illness, however, could not be ignored. The cancer advanced relentlessly, leaving him in constant pain. Operations multiplied, prostheses grew heavier, more grotesque. Eating was agony, speaking a trial. Yet Freud insisted on dignity. He received visitors in his study, cigar in hand despite the pain, speaking of death with calm resignation. "Death is the most natural thing in life," he told one friend, "and yet it is also the hardest to accept." By September 1939, as Europe plunged into war once more, Freud's suffering became unbearable. True to his lifelong conviction that reason should govern even the most intimate matters, he requested that his doctor administer a final dose of morphine to ease his passage. On September 23rd, surrounded by Anna and a few loyal companions, Sigmund Freud died in his London home. He was 83 years old. The funeral was modest but dignified. His ashes were placed in a Grecian urn gifted years earlier by Princess Bonaparte, resting now in Golders Green Crematorium. Anna Freud, grieving yet resolute, assumed the role of guardian of his legacy, ensuring that psychoanalysis would continue to evolve. For those who attended, the moment carried the weight of history, the end of a life that had redefined the human soul. Freud's exile was both tragedy and symbol. He had been forced from the city he loved, stripped of his homeland by hatred, and yet in his final months he achieved a kind of victory. He outlived his persecutors, left behind a body of work that no regime could erase, and died on his own terms, with lucidity and courage. The boy from Freiburg, who had once stared at the world with unsettling curiosity, had ended his journey in a foreign land, far from the narrow streets of Vienna. Yet his questions endured. What is hidden beneath our words and actions? How does repression shape our lives? Why do love and death intertwine in the human heart? These questions, born in Freud's restless mind, continue to haunt the world he left behind.